To truly understand what happened in that Asheville courtroom on that gray October morning, you cannot start with Lily. You cannot start with the judge, or the attorneys, or the silence that swallowed the room whole when a 3-year-old raised her finger and spoke. You have to start with Rex. Because Rex was not simply a police dog. He was not a prop, not a tool, not a warm body placed in a room to make frightened people feel slightly less frightened. Rex was something that trainers spend entire careers hopping to encounter once. An animal whose interior life ran deeper than his breed, deeper than his training, deeper than anything a certification program could manufacture or a leash could contain. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a witness, and he had been one from the very beginning. Rex was born on a cool April morning at a K-9 training facility outside Charlotte, North Carolina, one of 12 puppies in a litter that the facility's head trainer, a no-nonsense woman named Carol Briggs, had high expectations for. The bloodline was strong. The parents had both produced working dogs. Carol had already promised 3 of the pups to law enforcement agencies before their eyes were fully open. But within the first 2 weeks, she noticed something about the 5th pup, the one with the darker face and the slightly too serious expression, that she couldn't quite categorize. While the others tumbled and bit and barked at absolutely everything, this one sat. He watched, not lazily, the way tired puppies stare at nothing, intensely, purposefully, with a focus that seemed almost uncomfortably directed at the handlers who came and went, at the other dogs, at the sounds coming from beyond the kennel fence. He tracked human emotion the way other dogs tracked scent. Carol wrote in her evaluation log, "Pup 5 watches humans the way humans watch each other. Recommend advanced placement. This one understands something the others don't." She named him Rex. His training was rigorous and long, and he excelled at every stage of it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been born knowing what he was supposed to do. Tracking, apprehension, scent detection, crowd navigation, noise desensitization. Rex moved through each discipline without drama, without the hyperactive energy that burned out lesser dogs, without any apparent need for praise, though he accepted it graciously when it came. What set him apart, Carol would later tell Officer Mercer during the handoff, was not any single skill. It was his read on people. Put Rex in a room with a stranger and within 30 seconds he would have assessed them with an accuracy that experienced handlers found almost unsettling. Nervous, aggressive, grieving, hiding something. He cataloged human states the way a doctor reads vitals, quickly, accurately, and without personal judgment. He completed certification at the top of his class. Nobody was surprised. Officer Daniel Mercer was not the obvious choice to handle a dog like Rex. Mercer was 38 years old, a former Army staff sergeant from a small town in rural Tennessee who had come home from 2 tours overseas with a chest full of commendations and a very specific, very private difficulty with loud rooms and small talk. He was the kind of man who arrived early to everything, said exactly what he meant, and found most social interaction quietly exhausting. He had joined Asheville PD 6 years earlier, worked patrol without complaint, and had never once expressed interest in K-9 work. The assignment found him rather than the other way around, the result of a departmental reshuffling that a sergeant later described as accidental. The day Mercer walked into Carol Briggs' facility to meet his new partner, he shook her hand, looked at Rex, and said, "He's serious." Carol said, "So are you, that's why it'll work." She was right. From their very first week together, Mercer and Rex operated with a seamlessness that made other handlers quietly envious. They didn't need much: a look, a shift in weight, a particular stillness that communicated wait or now or something's wrong here without a word passing between them. Colleagues joked that they had been partners in a previous life. Mercer never laughed at this, which made people wonder if he secretly agreed. Their patrol years together built a record that the department quietly took pride in. They located a missing Alzheimer's patient in a creek bed behind a shopping center, Alive, cold, but alive, after a 12-hour search. They tracked a suspect through 4 miles of mountain terrain in the middle of a November night in rain without losing the scent once. They responded to a domestic violence call that escalated in ways Mercer later filed a detailed report about, and Rex's presence alone, standing between a terrified woman and a man twice her size, changed the outcome of that evening in ways a bullet might not have. But the moment people talked about most happened on a Wednesday afternoon in July, 3 years into their partnership. A 7-year-old boy named Marcus had wandered away from a family campsite in the Pisgah National Forest. By the time the call came in, he had been missing for 11 hours. The temperature was dropping. The forest was dense. 3 other search teams had turned up nothing. Rex found Marcus in 40 minutes. The boy was huddled under the exposed roots of a fallen oak tree, soaked, shaking, and so frightened he couldn't speak. Rex reached him first, crawled in beside him, and stayed there pressed against the boy's small shaking body, warm and absolutely still, until Mercer arrived 60 seconds later. When Marcus's mother came crashing through the tree line and dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her son, Rex sat back and let it happen. She grabbed him too, instinctively, pulling him into the embrace. Rex allowed it, and Mercer, who had watched his dog accept exactly nobody's uninvited affection in 3 years of partnership, stood at the edge of that scene and felt something shift quietly in his chest. He didn't have a word for it at the time. He found one later: grace. The reassignment to courthouse comfort work came the following spring, and Mercer's initial reaction was resistance dressed up as professionalism. Rex was a working dog, he argued. Patrol-trained, field-tested, built for active deployment. Sitting in a courtroom while attorneys argued felt like parking a fire truck in a museum. His lieutenant listened patiently, and then told him to report to the courthouse on Monday. The first session changed everything. An 8-year-old girl named Priya was scheduled to observe a preliminary hearing in a custody case, a proceeding so weighted with adult conflict that the child advocate had flagged her anxiety level as critically high. Priya arrived pale-faced and rigid, her hands balled into fists at her sides, her eyes darting to every door in the room like she was calculating exits. Rex walked to her, not quickly, not with performance. He simply walked to where she was standing and sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder pressed gently against her leg. Priya looked down at him. Rex looked up at her. 30 seconds passed. Then her fists opened. Her breathing changed. She reached down and rested her hand on top of his head, and the rigidity that had locked her small body for the entire morning dissolved so visibly, so completely, that the child advocate standing across the room had to look away. Mercer watched all of it, and he never questioned the reassignment again. By the time Lily walked into that courtroom on that gray October morning, Rex had sat beside 31 families through some of the worst hours of their lives. He had absorbed grief, fear, rage, and confusion with the same steady, open, undemanding presence, never asking anything of the people beside him except that they breathe and stay and let him be near. He had never failed a single one of them. But Lily was not like the others. The moment she came through that door, yellow dress, wide, careful eyes, 8 months of silence wrapped around her like armor, Rex turned his head toward her with an attention so immediate and so total that Mercer noticed it and quietly straightened in his chair. He had never seen his dog move like that before the person even reached him. It was as if Rex recognized her. Not her face, not her name, but her specific quality of silence, the particular weight of what she was carrying, as though he had been trained his entire life for exactly this moment, for exactly this child, and every case before her had simply been preparation. He was ready. And for the first time in 8 months, without knowing any of this, so was Lily. Every child carries a world inside them, a private universe built from the things they have seen, the things they have heard through walls they were supposed to be sleeping behind, and the things that have happened to them in rooms where no one else was watching. Lily's world was very small and very dark, and she had been living inside it completely alone for longer than any 3-year-old should ever have to. This is the story of that world, and of everything that happened before a yellow dress, a courthouse, and a German shepherd with amber eyes finally cracked it open. Lily was born in the early hours of a March morning in a small hospital in Buncombe County, North Carolina. The nurses remembered her mother, a young woman named Dara, 22 years old, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervousness that the staff quietly noted but professionally set aside. Dara held her daughter for 40 minutes after the birth, then asked a nurse to take her so she could sleep. It was not an unusual request. New mothers were exhausted. The staff thought nothing of it. But the pattern established in those first 40 minutes, Lily kneading, Dara retreating, would quietly define the first 3 years of Lily's life in ways nobody outside that apartment would fully understand until it was almost too late. They lived in a ground-floor apartment on the eastern edge of Asheville, a neighborhood that was not dangerous exactly, but carried the particular exhaustion of a place where people were always one setback away from something worse. The apartment had thin walls, a small kitchen that smelled of cigarette smoke even when nobody was smoking, and a window in Lily's room that looked out onto a parking lot where the light never quite reached. Dara was not a monster. This is important to understand. She was a young woman who had grown up in her own version of that small, dark world, passed between relatives, failed by systems, taught early that love was conditional and safety was temporary. She had never been shown how to be a mother because nobody had ever properly shown her how to be a child. She did her best. Some days her best was adequate, some days it was nowhere near enough. And then there was the man. His name was not important. It would become important later, in courtrooms and case files and official documents, but here, in Lily's world, he was simply the man with the loud boots. He had come into their lives when Lily was 18 months old, arriving the way certain people arrive in vulnerable lives, gradually, then all at once, until his presence filled every corner of the apartment, and there was no room left for anything that had existed before him. He was not loud all the time. That was the confusing part. The part that made Lily's small nervous system work overtime, always scanning, always calculating, never able to fully rest because the silence before the storm looked exactly like the silence that meant everything was fine. She learned, before she had words for the concept, that the most dangerous moments were the quiet ones. She learned to read the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Heavy and slow meant one thing. Quick and sharp meant another. She learned which floorboard creaked outside her door and what it meant when she heard it at night. She learned to make herself very small and very still, to breathe shallowly and take up as little space as possible, the way small animals go motionless when a predator is near. She was 2 years old when she learned these things. By 3, they were instinct. Ms. Karen Webb had been teaching preschool for 19 years when Lily joined her classroom at Bright Beginnings Early Learning Center on a Monday morning in September. Karen had a gift, one she had developed slowly and carefully over nearly 2 decades of watching small humans navigate large worlds, for reading what children couldn't say. She noticed Lily on the very first day. Not because the child was disruptive. Lily was never disruptive. She was, if anything, unnaturally well-behaved, the kind of stillness in a 3-year-old that looks like good manners from a distance and looks like something else entirely up close. She sat exactly where she was told to sit. She ate exactly what she was given. She never asked for more of anything, more food, more attention, more time at the art table, as though she had already calculated that asking was a risk not worth taking. Karen watched her for 3 days before she started keeping private notes. By the end of the first week, she had filled 2 pages. Lily flinched at sudden sounds, not the startled flinch of a sensitive child, but the full-body, breath-stopping flinch of someone braced for impact. She positioned herself in rooms the way adults with trauma histories position themselves, back to walls, eyes to doors, never fully absorbed in any activity because some part of her was always keeping watch. She was kind to the other children, particularly the smaller ones, with a protectiveness that seemed less like childhood empathy and more like hard-earned knowledge about what it felt like to be unprotected. And she never, ever talked about home. Other children talked about home constantly, about their dogs and their dinners and their parents and their Saturday cartoons. Lily listened to all of it with polite, careful attention and volunteered nothing. When Karen gently asked questions, "What did you do this weekend, Lily? What's your favorite thing about your house?" Lily would look at her with those wide brown eyes and give an answer so brief and so neutral it told Karen everything by telling her nothing. It was okay. It's fine. I don't know. Then came the Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks into the school year, when Lily arrived wearing a long-sleeved shirt on a warm day, and Karen noticed the edge of bruising along her left forearm. She knelt down to Lily's level at the cubby station, keeping her voice completely even, her face completely calm, every alarm in her body firing silently beneath a professional exterior 19 years in the making. "Lily, sweetheart, what happened to your arm?" Lily looked at her sleeve. Then she looked up at Karen with an expression that was not afraid, not defensive, not caught, but exhausted. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been asked to perform a particular scene many times before and simply does not have the energy for it anymore. And she recited her answer, flat, rehearsed, perfect in its careful construction. Karen listened to every word of it. Then she stood up, walked to her desk, picked up the phone and made the call that would, though she could not know it yet, save Lily's life. Child Protective Services moved within 24 hours. A caseworker named Jerome Ellis conducted the initial home visit, filed his report by the following morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Lily had been removed and placed with Sandra Hayes in Weaverville. The removal was quiet. There was no dramatic scene, no screaming, no struggle. Dara stood in the doorway of the apartment and watched them walk Lily to the car, and her face held an expression that Jerome Ellis would think about for a long time afterward, something caught between relief and devastation, the look of a person watching a weight be lifted that they had been carrying too long and were too broken to have put down themselves. Lily did not cry. She got into the car, held her backpack on her lap, and looked out the window the whole way to Weaverville, watching the streets slide past with those wide, careful eyes that had already seen too much and were still, somehow, looking for something. Sandra Hayes was 61 years old, gray-haired, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a warmth so genuine and so steady that children who had learned to distrust warmth entirely usually cracked within a week of living with her. She had fostered 23 children over 20 years. She had adopted 3. She had held hands through court dates and nightmare sessions and first days of school, and the specific, gutting grief of children who missed parents who had hurt them. Because love and harm can exist in the same place, and children know this in their bodies before they can explain it with words. She met Lily at the door on a Thursday evening and did something that surprised the caseworker accompanying them. She didn't kneel down to Lily's level. She didn't use a high, soft voice. She didn't make any of the well-intentioned, instinctive gestures that adults make towards small children in difficult situations. She just opened the door wider, stepped back, and said in her regular voice, "Come on in, I made soup." Lily looked at her for a long moment, then she walked inside. She said nothing for 3 days. Sandra did not push. She narrated her own movements quietly. "I'm making tea. I'll be in the kitchen," the way you speak around a wild animal you're trying not to startle, giving Lily the map of the house in sound so she always knew where Sandra was and what was coming next. She left the hallway light on all night. She never raised her voice. She knocked before opening doors. Small things, enormous things. On the 4th night, Sandra placed a stuffed German Shepherd on Lily's bed, a brown plush toy she had found at a thrift store that afternoon, drawn to it by some instinct she couldn't name and didn't try to explain. She set it on the pillow and left without comment. The next morning, Lily came to breakfast with the stuffed dog under her arm. She sat down, placed it on the table beside her bowl, and ate her oatmeal in silence. But the silence was different. Sandra noticed it immediately, the way you notice when the air pressure in a room changes, when something that was held very tight begins, almost imperceptibly, to loosen. It was the first morning since Lily had arrived that Sandra didn't feel like the child was bracing for something. She was still waiting. Sandra could feel it. That same deep, patient, exhausted waiting she had seen in Lily's eyes since the first evening, like a child who had been promised something important a long time ago and had not yet stopped believing it would come. Sandra just didn't know yet what it was. She would find out on a gray Tuesday morning in an Asheville courtroom, when her little girl in the yellow dress slipped free from her hand and walked across a silent room toward a silver-muzzled German Shepherd, and finally, found the safe place she had been searching for since the very beginning. There are moments in life that split time in two. Before and after. The world as it was, and the world as it becomes the instant something irreversible happens inside it. Most people live through only a handful of these moments. A phone call at midnight, a doctor's expression before he speaks, a door opening at exactly the wrong time. The people inside Courtroom 3 of the Buncombe County Courthouse on the morning of October 14th would spend the rest of their lives talking about theirs. Because none of them, not the judge, not the attorneys, not the seasoned court reporter who had sat in that chair through 15 years of human drama, had ever experienced anything like what happened when a 3-year-old girl in a yellow dress crossed an open courtroom floor and told the truth for the first time. The morning had begun without ceremony. Judge Margaret Collins had taken her seat at 9:15 a.m., reviewed her docket, and prepared for what her clerk had described as a standard child welfare status hearing. One of dozens she presided over each month, each one carrying its own particular weight, each one representing a family suspended somewhere between crisis and resolution, while the machinery of the law moved at the pace it always moved, which was never quite fast enough for the people caught inside it. The attorneys were present. The caseworker was present. The court-appointed guardian ad litem, a volunteer named Helen Marsh who had spent 3 years advocating for children in exactly these rooms, sat at the table with a folder she had read 4 times on the drive over. Sandra Hayes sat in the gallery with Lily beside her, the child's small hand wrapped around 2 of Sandra's fingers in the particular way Lily held on, not clinging, not desperate, but careful, deliberate, the grip of someone who had learned to hold only what they were certain wouldn't pull away. Rex sat near the side wall beside Officer Mercer, calm as furniture, his dark eyes moving slowly around the room in the unhurried, professional sweep that Mercer had spent 5 years learning to read. When Rex's eyes landed on the gallery and stayed there, Mercer followed his gaze. He saw the child in the yellow dress. He looked back at Rex. Rex had not moved, but something in his posture had changed, a subtle forward lean, barely perceptible, the kind of shift that meant his full attention had narrowed to a single point, and everything else in the room had ceased to exist for him. Mercer had seen this precisely twice before in 5 years of partnership. Both times, Rex had been right about something important. The hearing began. Judge Collins spoke. Attorneys responded. Papers were referenced and statements were made in the careful, procedural language of family court, a language designed to be precise, and which therefore often managed to drain the most devastating human circumstances of every drop of their emotional reality. Lily sat quietly beside Sandra and watched all of it. She watched the judge the way she watched everything, with that wide, patient attention that took everything in and gave nothing back. She watched the attorneys. She watched the court reporter's fingers moving over the keys. She watched the ceiling fans turning slowly overhead. And then she looked across the room and saw Rex. What happened in Lily's body in that moment was something no instrument in that courtroom could have measured. But Sandra felt it through the two fingers Lily was holding, felt the grip change, felt a tension she had grown so accustomed to over 8 months that she had stopped noticing it suddenly, completely release. Like a fist opening. Like a breath that had been held since March finally being let go. Lily's hand slipped free. She stood up from the bench. She was 3 years old and small for her age, and standing in that courtroom she looked impossibly tiny against the dark wood paneling and the high ceilings and the formal architecture of a room built to contain adult authority. Her yellow dress had small white buttons down the front. Her shoes were white with a single strap. Her brown hair was pulled back on one side with a clip Sandra had fastened that morning, while Lily stood perfectly still and stared at herself in the bathroom mirror with those serious, ancient eyes. She took one step into the aisle. Sandra's hand moved instinctively toward her, then stopped. Something about the way Lily was moving made Sandra's hand fall back to her lap. She could not have explained this decision later, could not have articulated what exactly she saw in her little girl's posture that made her hold back. She just knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had spent 20 years learning to read children, that this moment did not belong to her. It belonged to Lily. The attorney nearest the gallery had turned at the movement, a reflex, the way people turn toward motion in a peripheral field, and his sentence died in his mouth unfinished. The court reporter's fingers paused above the keys. A juror in the second row shifted forward without realizing it. Judge Collins looked up from her papers. Lily walked forward. She did not walk the way frightened children move in unfamiliar adult spaces, hesitantly, with backward glances, checking faces for permission at every step. She walked with direction, with certainty, as though the distance between herself and Rex was a road she had been traveling toward for 8 months, and she was simply, finally, arriving. Rex rose slightly from his seated position as she approached, not standing fully, not breaking his trained composure, but lifting with the subtle readiness of an animal who knows what is coming and is positioning himself to receive it properly. Mercer's hand tightened once on his knee, then deliberately, consciously, he released it. "Let the dog work." Lily stopped 3 feet from Rex. She looked at him, he looked at her. The entire courtroom looked at both of them. And then Lily raised her right arm slowly, with complete intention, the way a person points at something they have been searching for and have finally, after a very long time, found, and extended her small finger directly at Rex. The room was already silent. But when she spoke, it became a different kind of silent, the kind that has weight, the kind that presses against the walls and settles into the floor and stays in the room long after the people have left it. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But every single person in that courtroom heard every single word with absolute clarity. "He keeps me safe." 4 words. 4 words that landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, the impact small, the ripple enormous, spreading outward in every direction at once. Sandra Hayes made a sound she would never be able to describe, something between a gasp and a sob that she caught with her hand before it fully escaped, pressing her fingers hard against her mouth, eyes wide and filling fast. The defense attorney's pen rolled off the table. Nobody looked at it. Nobody moved to pick it up. It hit the floor, and the small sound it made was the only sound in the room for 3 full seconds. Helen Marsh, the guardian ad litem who had spent 3 years advocating for children in these rooms, and believed she had developed a professional armor sufficient to withstand anything these proceedings could produce, felt that armor develop a crack she would carry with her for the rest of her career. The court reporter's hands were completely still above the keys. not paused still. The stillness of someone who has forgotten, temporarily, what their hands are for. And Judge Margaret Collins, 23 years on the bench, a woman who had presided over murders and custody battles and the full terrible spectrum of what human beings do to each other, and to the children caught between them, sat back in her chair with an expression that the clerk beside her had never seen on her face before and would describe later privately as something close to awe. Then Lily took the final 3 steps forward and sat down on the cold tile floor directly beside Rex. Rex lowered his head into her lap with the gentleness of someone handling something irreplaceable. And Lily began to talk. It came out slowly at first, tentatively, the way water finds its path through cracked ground, uncertain of the route but certain of the direction. She spoke with her hands buried deep in Rex's fur, her face turned slightly down toward him, as though she were telling him rather than the room, as though everyone else had ceased to exist and there was only this dog and this truth and the relief of finally putting it down. Described a man. She described his boots loud on the wooden floor, the specific sound they made that meant she needed to be very still and very quiet and very small. She described a room she was sometimes put in, no window, no light, just the sound of her own breathing and the strip of yellow under the door that told her the rest of the world still existed. She described a door with a lock she could never reach and tried anyway, every time, because 3-year-olds have not yet learned to stop trying. She spoke in the fragmented, imagistic, devastatingly honest language of a very small child describing very large horrors. And every fragment landed in that courtroom like evidence, like testimony, like the locked door finally swinging open from the inside. Officer Mercer sat without moving. His military training, his trauma response certification, every professional instinct he possessed was focused on a single directive. Do not move, do not speak, do not change one single variable in this room. His eyes were dry, his hands were still. Later, alone in his car in the parking garage, they were neither. Judge Margaret Collins raised 2 fingers slowly toward the court recorder on the bench. The red light blinked on. The room held its breath and listened to a 3-year-old girl tell the truth, and the German shepherd in her lap held perfectly, faithfully still, because he had known from the moment she walked through that door that she had something important to say. He had just been waiting for her to feel safe enough to say it. There is a particular kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness. The silence of a room so saturated with what just happened inside it that ordinary sound cannot yet find its way back in. The silence of 23 people sitting in wooden chairs, each one privately recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the morning they had walked into. That was the silence inside Courtroom 3 at 10:47 a.m. on October 14th, when Judge Margaret Collins set down her pen, folded her hands on the bench in front of her, and spoke 2 words into the weighted air. "We'll recess." Nobody moved immediately, not because they hadn't heard her, because the body sometimes needs an extra moment to follow instructions when the mind is still catching up to what the eyes just witnessed. Then slowly, the room began to breathe again. The courtroom emptied the way sacred spaces empty, carefully, quietly, with the instinctive reverence people extend to rooms where something significant has just occurred. Attorneys gathered their folders without the usual shuffling urgency. Spectators filed out in something close to single file, speaking in low voices or not at all. The court reporter sat for a long moment with her hands in her lap before she stood. Sandra Hayes did not move until Lily was ready to move. Lily sat beside Rex for 4 more minutes after the recess was called, her hands still buried in his fur, her breathing slow and even, her face carrying an expression Sandra had never seen on it before. Not happy exactly, not relieved exactly, something older and quieter than either of those things. the expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally, in the presence of exactly the right witness, been able to set it down. Officer Mercer waited, Rex waited. When Lily finally stood, she looked at Rex for a long moment, directly, seriously, with the solemn intentionality that characterized everything she did. Then she placed her small hand briefly on top of his head. One pat, deliberate and complete. Rex's tail moved once. Sandra took Lily's hand, and they walked out together. Judge Margaret Collins did not go to lunch that day. She sat in her private chambers with the door closed, and a cup of tea going cold on her desk, and spent 45 minutes doing something she had not done in a professional setting in over a decade. She thought. Not about procedure. She knew procedure the way she knew her own handwriting, instinctively and completely. She thought about the girl in the yellow dress, about the 8 months of silence that had preceded 4 words, about the specific quality of certainty in a 3-year-old's voice when she pointed at a dog and said, "He keeps me safe," a certainty that contained within it, unmistakably, the implication that something else had not. She had presided over thousands of cases. She had heard testimony from witnesses of every age, background, and emotional state. She had learned, through 2 decades of sitting above human suffering and being asked to make order from it, to protect herself from being personally moved by the things that passed through her courtroom. She had not been protected today. She picked up her phone and made the first of several calls. The meeting in her chambers at 11:30 a.m. included 4 people: lead attorney for the state Marcus Webb, defense attorney Robert Haynes, child advocate Patricia Moore, and forensic specialist Dr. Sandra Klein, who had driven 40 minutes from her office at the Buncombe County Child Advocacy Center when Patricia called her 20 minutes earlier and described what had happened in the courtroom that morning. Dr. Klein sat down, opened her notebook, and said nothing for the first 2 minutes. She let Patricia finish describing the scene, the walk across the courtroom, the 4 words, the way Lily had spoken to Rex with her hands in his fur. And then she asked 3 precise, clinical questions that cut through the emotional weight of the room and reoriented everyone toward the task at hand. Because the task at hand was enormous. Under North Carolina General Statute Chapter 7B, the Juvenile Code governing child abuse, neglect, and dependency proceedings, what Lily had disclosed in that courtroom constituted a reportable statement from a child witness that mandated immediate forensic follow-up. The informal setting did not reduce its legal weight. The age of the child did not diminish its significance. If anything, both factors amplified the urgency. The law was clear. What happened next had to be handled with a precision that matched the fragility of what they were working with, because a child's disclosure, once contaminated by improper questioning or procedural missteps, could become legally unusable, and the thought of Lily having finally spoken and having that testimony fail her because of an adult's mistake was something none of the people in that room were willing to contemplate. Dr. Klein explained the process to the attorneys in the measured, authoritative tone of someone who had navigated this exact terrain hundreds of times and understood that the path forward was narrow and required everyone to walk it carefully. A forensic interview would be conducted at the Child Advocacy Center. Lily would be interviewed by a specialist trained specifically in the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development Protocol, a research-based methodology designed to elicit accurate, detailed information from child witnesses while minimizing suggestibility and contamination. The interview would be recorded. Attorneys from both sides could observe through a one-way mirror. The specialist would ask the questions. No one else would speak to Lily about the content of her disclosure until the interview was complete. The interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. Patricia Moore caught Sandra Hayes in the hallway outside the courtroom before she reached the elevator. Sandra was composed, the practiced composure of a woman who had learned to hold herself together in courthouse hallways, because children could read adult distress with terrifying accuracy, and Lily was currently 3 feet away examining a water fountain with focused curiosity. Patricia explained what would happen the following morning. She explained it clearly and completely, the way she explained things to every foster parent, with full information and full respect, because the people who showed up for these children every single day deserved nothing less. Sandra listened to all of it without interrupting. When Patricia finished, Sandra was quiet for a moment. She looked down the hallway at Lily, who had moved from the water fountain to a framed photograph on the wall, a landscape, mountains, the blue ridge in autumn color, and was studying it with that characteristic serious attention she brought to everything. Then Sandra looked back at Patricia and asked her question. She asked it quietly. She asked it without drama or demand, but she asked it with the full weight of 8 months behind it. 8 months of stuffed dogs on pillows and hallway lights left on and knocked doors and soup made without being asked, and every small, enormous act of careful love that had slowly, incrementally, built the foundation of safety that had allowed a little girl to walk across a courtroom floor today and tell the truth. Can Rex be there? Patricia Moore had been in family court for 15 years. She had heard thousands of requests from parents, foster parents, guardians, and advocates, requests born of love and fear and desperation, and hope in every combination imaginable. She had granted many of them. She had denied more than she liked to think about when the law required it, and her own feelings about the requirement were entirely beside the point. This request was not in the standard protocol. Comfort dogs were approved for courtroom settings and waiting areas. Their presence in forensic interview rooms was a newer, less uniformly established practice, supported by a growing body of research, but not yet universally standardized across North Carolina's advocacy centers. Patricia looked at Sandra. She thought about a 3-year-old girl sitting down on a cold courtroom floor and speaking for the first time in 8 months because a German shepherd had been in the room. She excused herself, walked to the window at the end of the hallway and made 2 phone calls, then a third. Then she sent an email to the director of the Buncombe County Child Advocacy Center that was 3 sentences long and contained, in its final sentence, a summary of what had occurred in Courtroom 3 that morning that caused the director to stop reading, sit back in her chair, and immediately pick up her own phone. By 4:30 that afternoon, the authorization had moved through every necessary channel. By 6 o'clock, Officer Daniel Mercer's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter with a message from his lieutenant that read simply, "Rex is approved for tomorrow, 9 a.m. CAC. Don't be late." Mercer read it twice. Then he looked across the room at Rex, who was lying on his bed near the back door with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes open, watching Mercer with that familiar, patient, quietly knowing attention. "We're going back tomorrow," Mercer said. Rex's tail moved once against his bed. Sandra told Lily that evening after dinner. She kept it simple. Tomorrow morning we're going to a special place, and Rex is going to be there. She watched Lily's face as she said it, the way she always watched Lily's face, reading the small signals that the child's voice still rarely transmitted. Something moved across Lily's features, something quick and luminous and completely unguarded, there and gone in less than a second, like a flash of sunlight through fast-moving clouds. She looked down at her plate, picked up her fork. Then, in a voice so quiet Sandra had to lean forward to hear it, Lily asked a question she had never asked about anything before. Not about school, not about meals, not about the stuffed dog on her pillow or the light Sandra left on in the hallway or any of the 100 small arrangements that structured her careful, cautious daily life. She asked what time. Sandra told her. Lily nodded once, with the solemn satisfaction of someone confirming an appointment they intend to keep. And that night, for the first time since she had arrived in Weaverville 8 months earlier, She was asleep before Sandra finished tucking her in. The stuffed German shepherd was under her arm. Her face in sleep was completely at peace. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. And for the first time in a very long time, Lily was ready. There is a specific kind of mourning that exists only in the lives of people who have spent the night holding their breath. Sandra Hayes had not slept, not properly. She had moved in and out of something that resembled sleep the way a shallow puddle resembles an ocean, surface level, insufficient, leaving her more tired at 5 a.m. than she had been at midnight. She lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe and thought about tomorrow, which had become today before she was ready for it. She rose at 6, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window and watched the early light come slowly over the mountains the way it always did in Weaverville, gradually, gently, as though the day understood that some mornings required a softer arrival. At 6:45, she heard the small sound of feet on the hallway floor. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair loose around her face, stuffed German shepherd held against her chest with both arms. She looked at Sandra. Sandra looked at her. "You're up early," Sandra said, keeping her voice exactly as ordinary as she could make it. Lily walked to her chair at the kitchen table, climbed up, set the stuffed dog carefully on the table in front of her, and looked at Sandra with those wide, serious eyes. "Is it time?" she asked. Sandra felt something move through her chest that she would have called heartbreak if it hadn't also, simultaneously, felt exactly like hope. "Not yet, baby," she said, "but soon." The Buncombe County Child Advocacy Center sat on a quiet street 3 miles from the courthouse, a low, warm-colored building designed with the specific intention of looking like nothing institutional. No harsh lighting visible from outside. No official signage that announced its purpose to the street. Just a building that looked, from the outside, like a place where someone had taken considerable care to make sure the people who came inside would feel, from the very first moment, that they were somewhere safe. Sandra pulled into the parking lot at 8:52. Before she had fully stopped the car, Lily had unclipped her seatbelt. Sandra looked in the rearview mirror. Lily was sitting forward in her car seat, hands flat on her knees, eyes fixed on the building's entrance with an attention so focused it was almost physical in its intensity. "He's already inside," Sandra said quietly. Lily's hands pressed harder against her knees. They walked to the entrance together, Lily's hand in Sandra's, the stuffed German shepherd tucked under Lily's free arm. Sandra held the door open. Lily walked through without hesitating. And there, in the soft-lit waiting area of the Buncombe County Child Advocacy Center, sat Rex. Officer Mercer had arrived at 8:15. He was always early. It was a habit so deeply ingrained from his Army years that being anything less than 15 minutes ahead of schedule produced in him a low-grade anxiety he had never fully been able to reason away. He had signed Rex in at the front desk, received a brief orientation from the center's intake coordinator about the layout of the interview room and the protocols in place, and then settled into a chair in the waiting area with Rex beside him and his coffee in his hand, and the particular focused stillness he always inhabited before something important. Rex sat beside him and watched the door. He had been watching the door since they arrived. Mercer noticed this. He noticed everything Rex did, the way long partnerships produce a hyper-awareness of the other person's, or in this case, the other animal's behavioral baseline. Rex sitting and watching the door was not unusual. Rex sitting and watching the door with that specific forward-leaning, breath-held quality was different. He was waiting for her. Mercer drank his coffee and said nothing. When the door opened at 8:53 and Sandra Hayes walked in with Lily, Rex rose from his seated position, fluidly, without urgency, but completely and immediately, and oriented his full body toward the child. Lily saw him before she had fully cleared the doorway. She crossed the waiting room in 7 steps and buried her face in his neck and held on. Rex stood absolutely still and let her. Mercer looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at his coffee. "Okay," he said quietly to nobody in particular. "Okay." Dr. Anita Rhodes had a particular way of entering an interview room. She did not rush. She did not perform warmth, she simply had it. The genuine article, the kind that children who have been failed by adults can detect as authentic from 20 feet away, because their survival has depended on learning the difference. She was 44 years old, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead, and a voice calibrated by 11 years of practice to the exact frequency of calm. She had reviewed Lily's file the previous evening, all of it, the removal report, the therapeutic notes, the guardian ad litem's observations, the court recorder's transcript of what had occurred in Courtroom 3. She had read that transcript 3 times. Then she had sat quietly in her office for 10 minutes before going home, because some case files require a moment of stillness before you can properly close them and return to the rest of your life. She met Lily in the waiting area, knelt to her level, and introduced herself in a voice that made no demands and carried no agenda. Lily looked at her carefully, then looked at Rex, then back at Dr. Rhodes. "Is Rex coming?" Lily asked. "Yes," Dr. Rhodes said, "Rex is coming." Lily considered this. Then she nodded, with the decisive finality of someone who has just received the one piece of information required to make a decision, and walked toward the interview room door. The room was painted the color of warm butter. Low furniture, soft rugs in muted colors, a small table with a basket of crayons and plain white paper, a bookshelf at child height with picture books arranged with their covers facing out, a window with frosted glass that let in light without revealing the world outside. Everything in the room had been chosen with the same deliberate, research-backed intentionality. Every color, every texture, every sight line designed to communicate a single message to a child walking through the door. "You are safe here. Nothing in this room will hurt you." Rex walked in beside Lily and positioned himself near the center of the room with the unhurried authority of someone who has assessed the space and determined where he is most useful. He sat. He looked at Lily. Lily looked around the room once, a single, sweeping assessment, the habitual security check of a child who had learned to read rooms before she could read words. Then her eyes came back to Rex, and whatever the room's assessment had produced was rendered irrelevant. He was here, that was sufficient. She sat down on the rug beside him. What happened over the next 53 minutes was something Dr. Anita Rhodes would later describe in a professional paper as the most clinically significant example of animal-facilitated disclosure she had encountered in 11 years of forensic practice. She did not use Lily's name in the paper. She did not use Rex's. She described them as Subject C and Therapy Animal R in the careful anonymizing language of academic publication. But the data was real, and the data was extraordinary. Lily's verbal output in the first 10 minutes of that session exceeded her total documented verbal output across 4 previous therapeutic sessions combined. Her responses to open-ended prompts were detailed, sequential, and internally consistent, qualities that forensic specialists look for specifically because they indicate genuine memory retrieval rather than suggestion or confabulation. She answered questions. She elaborated without being asked. She used specific, concrete sensory language, the smell of something, the sound of boots, the particular cold of a floor under bare feet, the kind of language that lives in the body rather than in rehearsed narrative. And every time the weight of what she was describing became too much, every time the words slowed and her breathing changed and her hands tightened in Rex's fur, she would pause, press her face against his neck, take 3 slow breaths and continue. Dr. Rhodes observed this pattern repeat 7 times across the session. Each time Rex remained perfectly, faithfully still, not passive present. There is a difference, and it was visible. He was not simply tolerating Lily's proximity. He was actively, consciously holding space for her in the specific way that certain extraordinary animals hold space, as if they understand at some level beyond training that this is what is needed and they are the right one to provide it. Behind the one-way mirror, the state's attorney stopped taking notes at the 20-minute mark, not because nothing was happening, because everything was happening, and watching it required the full use of faculties he could not spare for writing. Sandra stood in the observation corridor for the first 30 minutes. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest and her back straight and her face composed, because she was a woman who had learned to hold herself together in rooms like this one, in the dark hallways and waiting areas and observation corridors of courthouses and advocacy centers and hospitals where children's futures were decided. She lasted 30 minutes. Then she turned and walked to the end of the corridor and stood against the wall and cried, quietly, completely, with the full weight of 8 months releasing all at once. The accumulated grief and fear and hope and love of every morning Lily had sat silent at her kitchen table, and every night she had slept with a stuffed dog pressed against her chest, and every single moment Sandra had watched her little girl carry something enormous in a body far too small for it. She cried until she had nothing left. Then she wiped her face, straightened her back, and walked back to the window. Inside the room, Lily had her face pressed into Rex's neck, taking her 3 breaths. Then she lifted her head and kept talking. Officer Mercer sat in the plastic chair in the hallway outside. Rex's leash was folded neatly across his knees. His coffee had gone completely cold an hour ago. The hallway was quiet and beige and entirely without character, the kind of institutional corridor that exists purely as a passage between more important spaces. He sat in it for 53 minutes and did not move. He had been in combat. He had extracted wounded soldiers from situations that required a specific, practiced suppression of every instinct that was not immediately useful. He had learned to be still when stillness was the most important thing he could offer. He sat in that plastic chair and was still. And when the door finally opened and Dr. Rhodes stepped into the hallway with a look on her face that answered the question before he could ask it, he nodded once slowly and let out the breath he had been holding for 53 minutes. Rex walked out beside Lily. Lily walked directly to Mercer and looked up at him with her wide brown eyes, serious, clear, carrying something new in them that had not been there the day before. Not happiness, not relief. Something quieter and more permanent than either. Something that looked, to a man who had spent his career in the business of protection, exactly like the first fragile, irreplaceable architecture of safety beginning to take hold. He looked down at her. "You did good today," he said. Lily considered this for a moment. Then she looked at Rex. "He helped," she said. Mercer's jaw tightened once, then released. "Yeah," he said, "he always does. There is a particular way that important things travel through the world. Not loudly, not with announcement, not with the immediate crashing visibility of breaking news or viral moments that burn bright for 48 hours and then disappear into the scroll. Important things, the things that actually change how people think and work and show up for each other, move differently. They move the way water moves through limestone, slowly, quietly, through the smallest available openings. And then one day, without dramatic announcement, something that was solid has been changed by something that was patient. What happened in Courtroom 3 on October 14th moved like water through limestone. And by the time most people knew it was moving at all, it had already gone further than anyone expected. The first person outside the courthouse who heard the story was Patricia Moore's supervisor. Patricia had submitted her case notes the evening of October 14th, a document that was, by the standards of family court case notes, remarkably restrained in its language and remarkably difficult to read without feeling something shift in your chest. She described the events of the morning in the careful, clinical vocabulary her profession required. She used phrases like spontaneous disclosure and child-initiated approach and animal-facilitated communication. The correct terms, the professional terms, the terms designed to hold observed reality at a slight documentary distance. But even through that careful language, the story was visible. Her supervisor, a 20-year veteran of child welfare administration named Louise Garrett, read the notes twice in her office on the morning of October 15th. Then she forwarded them, with Patricia's permission and all identifying information removed, to the director of the North Carolina Child Advocacy Center's network with a single line of her own appended at the bottom. "You need to read this." The network director read it the same afternoon. She picked up her phone and called 2 colleagues in neighboring states. Those colleagues called others. By the end of the week, the story had traveled carefully, anonymously, with every detail that could identify Lily stripped away, through a network of child welfare professionals spanning 7 states. And everywhere it landed, it produced the same response. Silence first, then questions, then action. The questions came from everywhere, and they were specific. How was the comfort dog authorized for the forensic interview setting? What protocol governed his presence? What training had the handler received? What did the research say about animal-facilitated disclosure in child trauma cases? And why wasn't that research being implemented more broadly and more quickly? These were not rhetorical questions. They were the questions of professionals who had spent careers working with traumatized children and who recognized, in the story of one small girl and one German shepherd in one North Carolina courtroom, a gap between what the research supported and what was actually being practiced. A gap measured in children who sat in interview rooms and said nothing because the conditions required to make them feel safe enough to speak had not been created. Dr. Anita Rhodes began receiving emails within 10 days of the session. Colleagues from Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, and eventually from states she had never worked in, Ohio, Texas, Colorado, Washington, reached out through professional networks asking for the details of her methodology, her protocols, her observations on Rex's behavior and Lily's response. She answered every email. Then she did something more useful, she wrote. The paper Dr. Rhodes published 6 months later in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect was titled, in the measured language of academic publication, Animal-Assisted Facilitation in Forensic Interviews with Child Trauma Survivors, a case study and framework for implementation. It was, by the standards of academic papers, not a long document. 31 pages, 47 footnotes, 6 pages of references citing research from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Israel. But within the specific professional world it entered, it landed like a stone thrown into still water, the ripple moving outward in every direction at once, reaching shores that the stone itself could never have anticipated. It was downloaded 4,000 times in its first month of publication. It was cited in subsequent research papers, policy proposals, grant applications, and legislative briefings. A professor at the University of North Carolina used it as a foundational text in a graduate course on trauma-informed practice. A researcher at Duke began a longitudinal study on the neurological impact of animal-assisted intervention in child forensic settings, citing the case described in Rhodes's paper as the catalyst for her inquiry. Lily was never named. Rex was never named. But they were present in every page of it, between every line, in the space where the clinical language opened briefly and something human looked through. Officer Daniel Mercer received the invitation to speak in Washington on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 4 months after October 14th, 3 weeks after Rex's 9th birthday, on a day when the temperature in Asheville had dropped to 22 degrees, and Mercer was sitting in his truck in the precinct parking lot eating a sandwich and thinking about nothing in particular. The email was from the organizing committee of the National Symposium on Trauma-Informed Policing. It was formal, complimentary, and specific. They had heard about his work through the network. They wanted him to present. They were offering travel, accommodation, and a 30-minute slot on the second morning of the 3-day conference. 400 attendees, Washington, D.C. main stage. Mercer read the email. Then he closed his phone and finished his sandwich. That evening he told his wife, Carol, about it. He told her in the same tone he used to describe logistical problems at work: flat, factual, slightly weary. He said he wasn't a speaker. He said he was a police officer who worked with a dog, not a presenter who worked with a podium. He said he didn't have anything to say that a 30-minute slot in Washington required, and that the people who attended these conferences were academics and administrators and policy, people who spoke a professional language he had never been fluent in. Carol listened to all of it. Then she looked at him across the kitchen table with the particular expression she had developed over 14 years of marriage, not unkind, not unsympathetic, but entirely unmoved by the argument. She said, "Rex deserves to have his story told." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "Rex would hate Washington," he said. "Rex," Carol said, "would be fine." They flew in on a Wednesday morning in April. Mercer wore his dress uniform. Rex wore his vest. The hotel concierge, a young man from Alabama who had grown up with German shepherds, abandoned all professional composure when they walked through the lobby and spent 4 minutes petting Rex with the unself-conscious delight of someone who had temporarily forgotten he was at work. Rex accepted this with dignity. The symposium was held in a conference center 3 blocks from the Capitol. The hallways were full of the specific energy of professional gatherings, badge lanyards and coffee cups, and small clusters of people having important-sounding conversations in doorways. Mercer moved through it quietly, Rex beside him, and felt the particular displacement of a man who operates best in fields and courtrooms and has found himself, through a sequence of events he still hadn't fully processed, standing in a carpeted corridor discussing methodology with a woman from the Department of Justice. He was introduced on the second morning by the symposium's director, who described his work in 2 sentences that were accurate and completely insufficient. Mercer walked to the podium. He looked out at 400 people, attorneys, law enforcement professionals, child welfare administrators, researchers, judges, policy advisors, people who had spent careers trying to make the systems that were supposed to protect children actually work. Rex sat beside the podium and looked out at the room with his amber eyes. Mercer put his prepared notes on the podium, looked at them for a moment, then set them aside. He described a gray Tuesday morning in an Asheville courthouse. He described a little girl in a yellow dress who hadn't spoken in 8 months. He described the way she crossed a silent room with the certainty of someone who had finally found what she had been looking for. He described 4 words spoken barely above a whisper that every person in the room heard with absolute clarity. He described Rex lowering his head into a 3-year-old's lap and holding still. He spoke for 28 minutes. When he finished, the room was completely quiet. Not the polite, transitional quiet of an audience preparing to applaud. The weighted, full quiet of 400 people sitting inside something they needed a moment to absorb. Then someone in the 4th row started clapping. And then everyone did. The effects moved outward from that morning, in ways Mercer would spend years learning about secondhand. 6 states launched formal reviews of their policies governing comfort animals in forensic interview settings and courtroom proceedings. The reviews were thorough, research-based, and slow, as policy reviews always are, but they moved. 3 of them produced updated guidelines within 18 months. 2 produced funded pilot programs. 1 produced legislation. A senator from Oregon, a former public defender who had spent 15 years in family court before entering politics, introduced a bill encouraging federally funded courthouses to develop and implement therapeutic animal programs for child witnesses and trauma survivors. The bill moved through committee with bipartisan support that surprised everyone who had expected it to stall. It didn't pass in its first session, but it moved, and in legislative terms, movement is everything. 2 universities began formal research studies. 4 nonprofit organizations that trained courthouse comfort dogs cited the case in funding proposals that were approved. A national training organization developed a new certification track for handlers working specifically in child advocacy settings, a track that drew directly from the protocols Mercer and Rex had followed and that Dr. Rhodes had documented. Mercer was asked to consult on the curriculum. He said yes. None of them knew Lily's name. Not the senator from Oregon, not the researchers at Duke, not the policy advisors in 6 states reviewing their comfort animal protocols, not the 400 people who had sat in a Washington conference room and listened to a quiet man from Asheville describe a morning that had changed everything. They knew a story. A true story, carefully anonymized, about a child and a dog in a courtroom and the specific, irreplaceable power of safety, of what becomes possible when a person, even a very small person, finally feels safe enough to speak. And every single one of them had been changed by it. In offices and courtrooms and conference rooms across the country, things were being reconsidered, protocols were being questioned. Gaps were being identified, programs were being funded and curricula were being developed and policies were being rewritten, all of it moving quietly, steadily, through the smallest available openings. Like water through limestone. Like a truth told for the first time by a 3-year-old girl with her hands buried in a German shepherd's fur. Still moving, still changing things. Still going further than anyone expected. Some stories end with verdicts. Some end with sentences, or settlements, or the sharp administrative click of a case file being officially closed. Some end with headlines or press releases, or the particular public finality of justice being seen to be done in the way that justice sometimes is, and sometimes only appears to be. This story does not end any of those ways. This story ends the way the best ones do. Not with a verdict, but with a life. Not with a closing argument, but with a child laughing in a parking lot on a warm Saturday morning, her face buried in the fur of an old dog who never once stopped believing she was worth waiting for. But to get there, you have to walk through everything that came between October 14th and that Saturday morning. Because the distance between a 3-year-old girl speaking her first truth in a silent courtroom and a 4-year-old girl laughing freely in the sun is not a short distance. It is a distance measured in court dates and therapy sessions, and slow, unglamorous, daily acts of love that nobody photographs and nobody applauds, and that constitute, in the end, the actual substance of healing. This is what that distance looked like, walked one day at a time. The legal proceedings concluded in the spring. Mercer was not in the courtroom for the final hearing. His presence was not required. And he had learned over years of this work that the institutional resolution of cases he had become personally invested in was something he processed better from a distance. He heard the outcome from Patricia Moore, who called him on a Thursday afternoon in April and delivered the news in the steady, professional voice she used when she was feeling something she had decided not to perform. The outcome was the right one. Every protective measure had been taken. Every legal avenue that needed to be closed had been closed. Patricia said, "She's going to be okay." Mercer said, "Yeah." There was a pause. "Tell Rex," Patricia said. Mercer looked across the room at Rex, who was lying on his bed with his chin on his paws, watching him with those amber eyes. "He already knows," Mercer said. Sandra Hayes began the formal adoption process in May. She had fostered 23 children over 20 years, and she had adopted 3 of them, each adoption the result of a long, private process of knowing that arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, inevitable recognition, like something becoming visible that had always been there, like a shape emerging from fog. With Lily, the recognition had arrived early, earlier than any of the others. Sandra had known by the end of the first week, not in a way she announced or even fully acknowledged to herself, but in the way the body knows things before the mind is ready to name them, in the way she started unconsciously pluralizing her future plans, in the way she began, without deciding to, thinking of the house as Lily's house too. The adoption process was long. It was paperwork and home studies and court appearances and waiting, the specific, grinding patience required by systems that move slowly by design because the stakes are too high for speed. Sandra moved through all of it with the same quiet, steady determination she brought to everything. She filled out every form. She attended every appointment. She answered every question from every evaluator with the complete, undefended honesty of a woman who had nothing to hide and understood that transparency was the price of the thing she wanted most. Lily came to one of the home study visits and sat beside Sandra on the couch and answered the evaluator's gentle questions in the careful, economical way. She answered most questions from adults she didn't yet fully trust. At the end of the visit, as the evaluator was gathering her things to leave, Lily looked up at her and said, unprompted in her quiet, serious voice, "Sandra keeps me safe." The evaluator wrote 3 pages of notes in her car before she drove away. The adoption was finalized on a Friday afternoon in December. The courtroom was smaller than Courtroom 3, a family court chamber used specifically for proceedings the law wanted to feel different from other proceedings, warmer, less adversarial, the architecture of the room itself communicating that what happened here was not about conflict, but about conclusion, about the formal, legal recognition of something that had already been true in every way that mattered for a long time. Judge Margaret Collins presided. This had not been required. Family court adoptions rotated through available judges on a scheduling basis, and Collins had no formal connection to Lily's case beyond that October morning. But when her clerk flagged the name on the docket and Collins saw it, she made a quiet arrangement that nobody questioned. She wanted to be there. She wanted to be the one to bring the gavel down on this particular ending. Sandra stood before her in a gray dress with her hands slightly shaking, not from nerves, but from the specific physical expression of emotion too large for a body to contain without some visible evidence. Lily stood beside her in a red dress, holding the crayon drawing she had made the previous evening with focused, laborious care. In the drawing, a woman, a girl, and a large brown dog, all outside, all in the sun, all holding hands with the wide-fingered, star-shaped hands of a child's drawing, radiating outward, open, reaching toward everything. Judge Collins looked at it over the rims of her reading glasses. "Is that Rex?" she asked. Lily considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "Yes," she said, "but he's bigger in real life." Collins smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had spent 23 years presiding over the full, terrible weight of what human beings do to each other and to the children caught between them, and who had learned to treasure without reservation the moments when the weight lifted. She brought the gavel down. Sandra's hand stopped shaking. Lily handed the drawing to the court clerk, who pinned it above her desk that afternoon. It stayed there for 3 years. Lily started kindergarten the following August at a small elementary school 4 miles from the house in Weaverville. Sandra drove her on the first day and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes after drop-off, not because she was worried exactly, but because 20 years of fostering had produced in her an involuntary vigil reflex on first days that she had never fully been able to override. Her teacher was a young woman named Ms. Danielle Porter, 26 years old in her second year of teaching, who would later describe Lily in her end-of-year report as one of the most quietly extraordinary children she had encountered in her short career. Lily was careful at first, watchful, measured, taking the temperature of every new space before committing to it. But she was not afraid. That was the thing Ms. Porter noticed most distinctly. There was a difference, she had learned, between children who were shy and children who were cautious, and a further difference between children who were cautious because they were naturally reserved and children who were cautious because the world had given them specific, experiential reasons to be. Lily was the third kind, but she was not afraid. She had something underneath the caution that Ms. Porter couldn't immediately name, a steadiness, a groundedness, something that functioned like a foundation even when the surface was still being carefully navigated. Something that had been built, slowly and deliberately, one knocked door and one left-on hallway light and one stuffed dog on a pillow at a time. By October, she was reading above grade level. By November, she was the first to notice when a classmate was upset and the first to do something about it, sitting beside them, not necessarily speaking, just being present in the particular way she had learned presence could be offered, the way a certain German shepherd had once offered it to her. By spring she had become, without anyone planning or engineering it, the unofficial guardian of every smaller child on that playground. Not bossy, not dramatic, just quietly, reliably there. Officer Daniel Mercer retired from active patrol duty 14 months after October 14th. He was 51 years old, eligible for full retirement, and had been offered a position that 3 years earlier he would have described as unnecessary and probably redundant. The position was full-time coordinator of the Asheville Police Department's Courthouse Comfort Dog Program, a program that, in the 14 months since Rex and Lily, had expanded from 1 dog to 4, from 1 courthouse to 3 facilities across Buncombe County. He took the job. He trained 2 new handlers that first year, younger officers, both skeptical in the way he had once been skeptical, both changed by their first sessions in the way he had been changed by watching Rex sit beside a frightened 8-year-old girl and feeling the armor of a child's fear simply dissolve. He certified 4 new dogs. He developed a handler training curriculum. He consulted with the national organization that had contacted him after Washington. He answered emails from law enforcement professionals in other states who had heard the story, always anonymized, always careful, and wanted to know how to begin. He did all of this from an office in the courthouse that was, by any objective measure, too small for a man his size and a dog his dog's size. He never complained about this once. Rex turned 9 in the spring. His muzzle had gone almost entirely white by then, the silver spreading from his chin upward until his whole face carried the distinguished, unhurried gravity of an elder. He moved more slowly. His joints complained on cold mornings in the way that joints do when they have carried a working body through 9 years of meaningful labor. He took the stairs deliberately now, without the fluid ease of his younger years. But his eyes had not changed. Those amber, watchful, deeply intelligent eyes, the ones that had made Carol Briggs write this one understand something in an evaluation notebook 9 years earlier, remained exactly as they had always been. Clear, present, attending to the human world around him with the same quiet, serious care that had defined him from the very beginning. He still worked, lighter hours, carefully managed, with Mercer monitoring him the way you monitor someone you love who refuses to admit they are slowing down. 3 days a week instead of 5, shorter sessions, more rest. But on the days he worked, he was fully present, fully Rex, sitting beside frightened people in rooms designed to feel safe, offering the specific, irreplaceable thing he had always offered, not a solution, not an answer, not anything the law could document or a policy could mandate. Just presence, just steadiness, just the ancient, uncomplicated, completely reliable message that living things can communicate to each other without a single word. I am here, you are not alone, it is safe to speak. On a warm Saturday morning in May, Sandra drove Lily to the precinct parking lot. It had become a monthly ritual over the past year, written into their shared calendar in Lily's handwriting, which was large and earnest and improving steadily. The letters still slightly uneven, but formed with the careful intentionality she brought to everything. She was out of the car before it had fully stopped. Sandra watched her go, this little girl in yellow shorts and a white shirt, running across the warm asphalt with her arms already open, laughing before she even reached him, and felt the particular fullness that had become the defining emotional texture of her life since December. Not the sharp, overwhelming feeling of the courtroom or the adoption chamber. Something quieter, something she could hold without it spilling over. Something that felt, after everything, like ordinary happiness. Which was the most extraordinary thing of all. Rex walked forward to meet her. Not running. He didn't run anymore. But he was moving toward her with everything he had, tail sweeping wide and slow, head up, amber eyes bright and completely focused on the small person racing across the asphalt toward him. She hit him like a wave. He received her like a shore, steady, warm, immovable, absorbing every bit of the impact and standing solid. She laughed into his fur. He pressed against her. She said something that Sandra, 20 feet away, could not hear, something quiet, meant only for him, the continuation of a conversation that had begun on a cold courtroom floor 14 months ago and had never really stopped. Officer Mercer stood in the precinct doorway with his coffee. He watched them. He had spent his whole career in the Army, on patrol, in courtroom hallways, in the business of protection. He had learned to recognize safety when he built it, and to recognize its absence when he arrived too late. He had learned what safety looked like from the outside, the cessation of vigilance, the release of held breath, the specific quality of a body that has finally stopped bracing for the next thing. He recognized all of it now, in a parking lot on a warm May morning, in the posture of a 4-year-old girl with her face buried in the fur of a 9-year-old dog. He drank his coffee, said nothing. Some things have already said everything there is to say. And somewhere inside that courthouse, above a court clerk's desk, a crayon drawing hung on a bulletin board, slightly faded now, the edges soft with time. A woman, a girl, a large brown dog. All outside, all together, all standing in the sun with their wide-fingered, star-shaped hands reaching outward toward everything. Exactly as it was always supposed to be. Exactly as it finally truly was.